to port 6667, evading the browser's port check. That was actually discovered by the respectable security group Goatsy Security. So props to them for discovering that cool attack. So at this point, Anna Faris has clicked my link, I've opened up her ports, and I can now see what services she's running. And she's running her own little web server. I can check out her website, and she's a Twilight fan. Just like me. Of course, she's going for Team Jacob. I'm more of a Team Edward kind of guy. But now that I know this, I know exactly how to get her. So, how do I get her? Well, let's talk about NAT pinning again. How do we prevent this? Make sure you have a strict firewall. If you can, don't allow unknown outbound connections. That's pretty strict, but if you can do it, do it. Make sure you're running an up-to-date browser. These browsers are fixing these problems. So again, keep up to date on your software. You know, when there's keep up to date on the security lists when you learn about these new issues. If you're using Firefox, use something like NoScript, or if there's other software that you can use to prevent these types of attacks. NoScript now blocks this issue. If you're on the client side, if you can, run a local firewall. For example, on Macs, you can run Little Snitch. It'll tell you when you're connecting to a port that that application normally doesn't connect to. So really, you just want to use multiple layers of protection, like I would use with Anna. So at this point, I can send her a message and I say, hey, you know what? This Samy guy is great. You need to meet him. He's an awesome person. He'll come over later. Now, I would ask her where she lives, but I can't do that. I'm pretending to be Robert. He obviously knows where she lives. So how do we do that? Well, the moment you've all been waiting for. XXXSS. We're going to use XXXSS to locate Anna Faris. All right, so how do we do this? First, Anna visits our malicious site, which I sent her in that Facebook message. After that, the XXXSS scans her local network for the type of router she uses. Well, how do we do that? It's easy. You can create some hidden iframes, or you can do this a number of ways. Look for specific IP addresses and CGIs or applications that we know that exist on each type of router. For example, a Belkin has this setup.cgi on 192.168.2.1. A Fios router has index.cgi on 192.168.1.1. So we can try connecting to any of those. Use, for example, an onload, and we'll know exactly what router they're using. Well, all right, how does that help us? From there, we can log in with default credentials if we have to. Most of the time, we don't have to. So how do we, again, we're basically using their web browser, their code distribution channel, to connect to their own router that we can't communicate with, because typically routers will not open up their web service to the world, only internally. Now, here is an example of actually logging into a router with default credentials. Most people don't change their default credentials on their routers. They may change the web password or WPA password, but the credentials itself to log in as admin, most people leave blank because they think, all right, you have to either know my WPA password to get on my network, or you need to plug in directly, which means you're in my house, which is scary enough. So I'm not really worried about this admin password. But with the web, we can make them connect to their own router and do what we want. So change your admin passwords on your routers. So what do we do? What do we do next? Well, we'll use XSS on the router to load malicious JavaScript. Okay. So Anna visits my malicious site. It determines what router she has. It then loads this XSS on her router, because now I know what kind of router she's using, to then load in malicious JavaScript that I'm hosting. All right. So what does that JavaScript do? The JavaScript uses AJAX to acquire the MAC address of the router. All right, so the MAC address. The MAC address is basically the hardware address that all network devices carry. It's how you communicate within a LAN. But how is that useful? It doesn't really tell us anything about that device except the type of device. The first 3 bytes will are actually registered to the specific vendor. So I might know that that router is a Linksys, but that's great. I already knew that. So what else does a MAC tell us? Well, it's easy to find out why. Just ping it. Here, I'll help you. Open up your browser and type www.bing.com. Hit enter. when the search bar loads, type in Google, and once you've done that, hit search, and you'll find Google. So, okay, Google. Why Google? Oh, because they know everything. If you haven't seen these already, these are some of the street view cars that go around, taking pictures of basically all the streets. So, Google actually knows everything. How does this relate? What does Google have to do with MAC addresses, have to do with Street View? Well, there's something really interesting about these Google cars. While they're driving around and they're taking pictures of your streets, of your homes, they are also collecting Wi-Fi data. Now, recently there was a big fuss about all this unencrypted Wi-Fi data that they're collecting. Well, that's completely unrelated. Despite all that data, if they were to trash that data today, they're collecting other data that no one really does care about. They're simply collecting MAC addresses and running GPS coordinates as they're driving around. So they're driving down the street, they see what their GPS coordinate is, they know exactly what it is, and then they see a network called Linksys. They say, oh wow, the strength is pretty low, and then they're driving and driving and driving, the strength gets higher and higher, and stronger and stronger and stronger, the GPS coordinates keep changing, and then it gets lower and lower and lower, the strength of the Linksys network. They've now just figured out approximately where that Linksys network is. And they've basically cross-referenced it with the MAC address. And as they go on to the next street, they see that same network again. And they now track these new GPS coordinates. And then the next street, they see it again. Now they can use basically triangulation to find out approximately where it's located. So, what can we do? Well, if you haven't seen already, HTML5 has basically a geolocation feature, and a couple of browsers are starting to implement this. Firefox implements this, and I believe the latest dev build of Chrome also implements this. Basically, you can go to a website, and it can execute some HTML5 and JavaScript and say, I want the location of the person visiting my site. Now, obviously, there's a huge privacy concern. They wouldn't just give up that info. So what happens is your browser drops down a little window and says, do you want to share your location with this website? Obviously, most people would say no. Now, what does that actually do? When you do hit share location, yes, I want to share my location, it creates this HTTP post, it sends it to Google, and it includes the MAC address of your router. Again, they've cross-referenced that MAC address with the Street View cars that are driving around and the exact location. So when you send this MAC address in this request, and you send it to Google, what they return? Jack Bauer level triangulation. Exactly where you're located. Now, I was a little unsure, how accurate this would be. So I actually compared it to my own, to basically this own router that I owned. And I compared the coordinates that I received to the actual address. Driving directions to Casa de Ferris, 30 feet. I looked over, my router was 30 feet away. It was amazing. So this is super accurate geolocation that can be done. And now I said, typically your browser will ask you, do you want to share this location information? And you can just say no. Well, that's not the case, because I now have your MAC address. Your router, if you recall, I basically use XXXSS to determine what kind of a router you have, then log into that router if I need to, take a remote JavaScript, load it onto the page, then load it onto the router then does an AJAX request, gets its own MAC address, sends it to me, I then take it, I make my own HTTP post request to Google, I then send that MAC address that your router sent to me into Google, they return actual coordinates, and I now know exactly where you live from you visiting my malicious website. You never get the drop down, you're never required to give me permission, and I know where you live. So, I'm sorry to say it, but privacy is dead. Thanks for coming, guys.